Hey everybody, it's Uncle John from Your Story Hour, and we're here to read two more chapters from The Mallards and Their Neighbors by author Neil Wayne Northey. Today, the chapters we're getting into are chapters 23 and 24, so let's get right after them. Chapter 23 is entitled Sawet the Owl is Disappointed. Mr. Bluebird was so interested visiting with Miner the Mole that he did not remember he had come after something to feed the baby bluebirds, and Miner the Mole was so interested hearing about the great wide world that he stopped his work for a visit. There was Mr. Bluebird, who had been many places and had seen many wonderful things, but did not know anything about the underground world where Miner lived. And there was Miner the Mole, who knew many things about his underground world, but who knew little about the great wide world. All Miner knew was that the great wide world was filled with flying enemies and walking enemies that pounced upon his friends whenever they showed themselves above ground, and that he had to be careful where he went. "Why are you digging so many secret tunnels here by the duck pond?" asked Mr. Bluebird. Then Miner the Mole told Mr. Bluebird some interesting things about his underground world. Said Miner the Mole, "I have been living down in what you call the Green Meadow. There are usually plenty of wriggly worms there for me to eat. But when the ground becomes dry and hard because there has been no rain, it is hard for me to dig. So I moved here by the duck pond where the ground is moist and soft. Even the wriggly worms like the moist ground, and some of them are not too far away. Some of them who live not too far away move here." "Why do you need so many secret tunnels?" said Mr. Bluebird. "Those are my hunting tunnels," said Miner the Mole. "I run through them when I hunt instead of walking above ground. Then my enemies cannot see me. Sometimes I find wriggly worms and cutworms and grubs and bugs in them. They walk in my hunting tunnels where they will not be seen by their enemies in the great wide world." "But don't you get lonesome working in your hunting tunnels all alone?" asked Mr. Bluebird. "I should think that you would want company." "Oh, no," replied Miner, "because you see, I am not alone. Sometimes there are more than 20 of us who are using the same hunting tunnels, and of course we meet quite often. We join our hunting tunnels together and then have plenty of company. But we are not always safe, even though we stay out of sight. Sometimes bad Digger the Badger comes along, and then we have quite a time to escape. Sometimes Reddy Fox and even Nero the Hound dig after us." "I suppose that Forktongue the Snake tries to catch you in your hunting tunnels too," said Mr. Bluebird. "Yes, he does. But one of our greatest enemies is Fearful the Man. You see, it is all the fault of Satchel Face the Pocket Gopher. Wherever Satchel Face Whenever Satchel Face finds where Fearful the Man has planted his crops, he burrows along the row and eats the sprouting little seeds. That makes Fearful the Man angry. Sometimes we also find where Fearful has planted his crops. Whenever there are sprouting little seeds, we know that there are sure to be cutworms and grubs to eat. Then we dig hunting tunnels all along the rows of the sprouting little seeds so we can catch the cutworms and grubs. But when Fearful the Man sees our hunting tunnels along his sprouting little seeds, he thinks Satchel Face has been helping himself to his crops. Then Fearful sets traps in our hunting tunnels. I do wish that someone would tell Fearful that we are trying to help him by ridding his garden of cutworms and grubs." "I think Fearful the Man should be more careful," said Mr. Bluebird. "Sometimes Trapper Jim also sets traps for us," said Miner. "Danny Muskrat told me once that Trapper Jim also sets traps for him. He said he heard Trapper Jim say that furs sell for a good price and that he could even sell moleskins now." While Mr. Bluebird was listening to Miner the Mole, the long shadows had been creeping across the old homestead, and Sawet the Owl had awakened from his all-day sleep. "Ho hum," he said sleepily. It's about time to look for a tender mouse to eat. He flitted through the treetops and alighted on a limb not far from where Mr. Bluebird and Miner the Mole was sitting. It was not yet quite dark enough for him to see well. Sawat the Owl was timid, and he never came out until after dark. So Sawat was quite sure that he saw a tender mouse on the ground, and he came a little nearer. Sure enough, he could see a ball of silky gray fur sitting up and squeaking like everything. It was Miner the Mole telling his troubles to Mr. Bluebird. Miner had entirely forgotten to watch for enemies, but Mr. Bluebird's bright eyes had seen Sawat the Owl. Sawat thought that Miner the Mole was a tender mouse. Of course, if he had known that it was Miner, it would have made no difference. A mole would have tasted as good to Sawat as any tender mouse would. So Sawat was all ready to drop down and grab Miner. An enemy, warned Mr. Bluebird as he darted away toward the nesting box near the grand old house. Miner the Mole did not wait to see which enemy was near. He ducked into his hunting tunnel almost before you could wink an eye, and Sawat the Owl sat there looking at a hole in the ground. Now, what do you suppose Mrs. Bluebird said to Mr. Bluebird when he returned to the nesting box without a fat grasshopper? Chapter 24. Bud Smith Sets a Trap. It was a hot day in August. The fluffy ducklets had awakened from sleeping in the shade of a drooping willow tree and grew along the marshy bank of the duck pond. But you would have never known that they were the same fluffy ducklets that belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Mallard. Each one had put on a brand new coat of feathers, and it would have been hard to tell them from Mr. and Mrs. Mallard at a distance. They were almost the same size as their parents. "Let's go for a swim," suggested Ducky Diver. "It's so hot here on the bank." "Quack, quack, quack, quack," said Mrs. Mallard, and she started toward the water, followed by the others. "I do believe it will be cooler in the water." Soon all the Mallards were splashing and diving and having a fine time playing tip-up. Whenever they saw something in the oozy mud on the bottom of the duck pond that they could not reach by playing tip-up, then they would play dive. Down they would go to the bottom out of sight, and when they were done, they would come up some other place. Tip-up and dive were the two games they liked to play best. But the young Mallards had learned another game that they liked quite as well. It was the game of sail. You see, they had grown strong wings, and they no longer had to swim across the duck pond unless they wanted to. If they wished, they could fly. Sometimes, when they became tired of playing tip-up and dive on one side of the duck pond, they would play sail over to the other side. Then they would play tip-up and dive again. What a good time they had! After they had splashed and ducked and dived for a while on that August day, Ducky Doodles became restless. He wanted a change. "Let's play sail over to the other side," he said. In a moment, all the Mallards were in the air, but instead of playing sail straight across the pond, Mr. Mallard led them higher and higher. Soon they were playing sail around and around, high above the water. At last, when their young wings began to get tired, Mr. Mallard set his wings and sailed gracefully down to the duck pond, followed by the young Mallards. "Oh, what fun that was!" exclaimed Ducky Waddles. "Let's do it again when we go back to the other side," said Ducky Doodles. "Yes, let's," said Ducky Diver. Now, it happened that when the Mallards were playing sail high above the water, Bud Smith was watching them from the front gate of the grand old house, and Mary had seen them from the fragrant flower garden where she was gathering a bouquet of marigolds. "Oh, did you see the Mallards?" said Mary as she came running toward Bud. "They were playing sail high above the water." "Yes, I saw them," replied Bud. "I suppose they were exercising their wings so that they will be strong enough to carry them to the sunny Southland one of these days. It won't be long until Jack Frost will start to paint the dancing little leaflets, and Old Man Winter will be here again. Why, school will start again in just 2 weeks." "I wish the Mallards didn't have to leave," said Mary. "But I suppose they can't be expected to stay here after the duck pond is frozen over." "No, I suppose not," said Bud. Bud was thoughtful as he turned and walked back toward the grand old house. The next day he came out to the mailbox carrying a letter. It was addressed to the Bureau of Biological Survey, Department of Agriculture, Washington, D.C. Some days later, a mysterious package and a letter in a long envelope were delivered by the mail carrier, and they were addressed to Bud and came from the Bureau of Biological Survey. "Now, what are you getting from the government?" said Mary. Bud smiled and said nothing as he hurried up to his room. That afternoon, Mary heard the sound of a hammer and a saw in the workshop, and when she entered the door, she found Bud covering a large, queer-looking, open-bottom cage with fine chicken wire. "What's that?" asked Mary. "Wait and see," teased Bud, and he drove a staple into place. In the back of the cage, Bud had built a small door, and over this door he had fitted a smaller cage that was covered on the bottom as well as the sides. This cage also had a door in it into which Bud could put his hand. "I'll bet that's a trap," said Mary, hoping to get Bud to say something that would betray his secret. "Wait and see," said Bud with a smile, and he drove in another staple. "You're not going to trap the Mallards, are you?" asked Mary. "Yes, of course I am," said Bud. Mary thought Bud was fooling her. "Truly. Now, what are you going to use that thing for? A rabbit hutch?" "I told you," said Bud. "I'm going to trap the Mallards in it." "But you're joking about that." "No, I mean it," said Bud. "Bud Smith, what are you going to do with those Mallards?" "You wait and see," laughed Bud. "How long must I wait?" "Until tomorrow," said Bud, and he resumed his hammering. And that's the end of chapter 24. Come back tomorrow, and Aunt Nikki will have chapters number 25 and 26 ready for you, and you'll get to find out what's going to happen between Bud and Mary and the Mallards. So come back then. All right. God bless. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.